Okay, good afternoon. I'm happy to welcome Professor Harrison from Warwick University. Thank you for being here with us today. ICAR is currently conducting a series of interviews with leading experts in order to put the current situation between Ukraine and Russia in a bigger picture. And well, Professor Harrison, you're an expert for economic history who is focused on Eastern Europe and the countries of the former Soviet Union.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I would like to ask you a few questions, and we will directly start with the following. Recently, UK Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said, we urge Russia to de-escalate and choose the path of diplomacy. If Russia persists with its aggression towards Ukraine and the UK, its partners will not hesitate to act. And there was no doubt that she was referring to new economic sanctions. And well, Professor Harrison, what can economic history teach us about this type of approach to foreign policy?
Thank you. So in the present context, I'm in favor of developing economic sanctions, both as a threat and deterrent and as a countermeasure in the event that conflict intensifies. But I think that we often lack clarity about what economic sanctions can achieve and what the risks are. And when one considers economic sanctions, I think the starting point should always be, what is the adversary's best response? And too often we think that the adversary will not have a response and that economic sanctions will simply impose an unaffordable burden and the adversary will be deterred and that'll be the end of the story. And in practice, I think what history tells us is that economic sanctions always take time to work. Often they can be predicted before they're adopted. And the adversary always has ways either to work around or to neutralize the effect of sanctions. And of course, the adversary's efforts in those directions are often costly. But all too often they're not unaffordable. So, if you think of sanctions having two effects, one is the immediate impact and one is the ultimate impact, then the ultimate impact is never the immediate impact as it appears at first sight, because the ultimate impact is simply to force the adversary to pay the cost of the countermeasures. And the adversary often becomes more ready to pay the price of the countermeasures than appears at first sight, because economic warfare is still warfare. And economic sanctions are often experienced as warfare. And so warfare by economic means often stiffens national feeling and makes people more ready to pay the price of war. And today we can see that faced with a very aggressive Russian stance on Ukraine's borders, NATO is more ready for conflict than it has been in the past. But the question we should ask is Russia too also more ready for conflict because of the measures that it can anticipate? And if you think of the countermeasures that are available to Russia, there are various things like Russia can become less dependent on Western markets, less dependent on Western currencies and payment systems and internet technologies, and Russia can also strengthen ties with China. Now, these things can't be done overnight. They take time. But also, in the more immediate future, Russia can also wage economic warfare against us. It can frighten foreign investors out of Ukraine. In fact, I would say it's already doing so. It can blockade Ukraine on land and sea. It can stop gas supplies to the European Union. But the most important thing is that Russian countermeasures might not be confined to the economy, because there is always a military response to economic sanctions, which is essentially to escalate. And there are many examples in history, but probably the clearest example is of 1940, when the United States wanted to curb Japanese aggression in China and imposed oil sanctions on Japan. And these were to be very costly to the Japanese economy. And the Japanese government, the leaders of Japan, did not think, oh, we can't afford this. Let's either wait for our war capability to be destroyed, or else we should just give up now. Rather, they took the decision to attack the United States directly. And if you look back, you can see that even at the time, they knew this was an outrageous gamble. But the point is they preferred that gamble to the certainty of being isolated and ground down if they simply accepted the oil sanctions of the United States. So, as I said, I favor sanctioning aggression, and I favor economic sanctions against Russia in the present context, and more so if a wider conflict turns out to be what happens. But we need to understand, if we rely too much on sanctions alone to avoid military conflict, essentially we're saying to Russia, you are strong militarily, but we have a stronger economic weapon. And Russian leaders may be likely to say, okay, so they may be strong economically, but we have the military advantage, let's use it. So we should never think, and too often economic sanctions are presented as a kind of cheap way to avoid goals, to achieve our goals without conflict. Economics, and often that's not the case. Economic sanctions are simply a phase of conflict or a form of conflict. They're not a substitute for military force. And sanctions can contribute to deterrence only if they're combined with a strong military defense. So I think, if you ask military people, they're often aware of this. But I think the public is often not aware, and the public thinks that when we go down the path of sanctions, that this is a way of staying out of a conflict, and I worry that we often don't appreciate the likely outcomes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this interesting statement. So, well, I would like to proceed to another question. Since the UK has left the EU, it has now to develop an independent strategy for international trade because it's not anymore part of the trading bloc. What are the prospects for the economic relations between the UK, Russia, and respectively Ukraine?
Well, I think the prospect for UK relations with Russia are quite poor at the moment. I don't put a very high weight upon the strategic or long-term calculations of the British government at the moment in relation to either country, because I think that the attention of our Prime Minister is very much focused on day-to-day survival. He faces problems on many fronts, and it suits him to appear to be taking up a position on the world stage. But I think from the very first moment that Boris Johnson came to office, he's shown that his character is to seek short-term advantage wherever possible and to not think very deeply about the long run. So I don't think I don't see that Britain is adopting a particularly long-term posture in relation to any of our partners, whether they're allies or adversaries at the moment.
Okay, but do you think that there is a conflict between government interests and the private sector when it comes to economic relations with Ukraine and Russia?
To a degree, yes. I mean, I think that the City of London and the London housing market have obtained a considerable benefit from at one time I would have called it capital flight, but it's not really capital flight, but the export of capital from Russia. And a lot of Russian money has found its way into the London money market and housing market, and also into the coffers of particularly of the Conservative Party. And so I think it's been a hard thing for Conservative politicians to wake up to the gap between private interests and the national interest in these matters. It's clear that attention is now being focused more and more on this, and I think that yesterday's announcements about the possible extension of sanctions to until now, British sanctions have been largely limited to interests directly involved in the occupation of Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and they could now be widened. But I think in some ways that's been a hard thing. A harder thing still will be to stomach the implications of further disruption in the European gas market if that comes about. And of course, that will adversely affect a much wider range of people in Britain as on the continent.
Gas market directly leads us to our next question. Boris Johnson has repeatedly expressed harsh criticism for the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project. Is he only concerned about security matters, or are the UK's economic interests at stake?
I wonder if you could develop your question a little. Do you mean competing interests with European Union on gas policy, or do you mean?
Yes, exactly.
Right.
I was referring to competing. Yeah.
Well, okay. So I certainly think that Boris Johnson believes it's in his, at least his short-term interests, which may be the only interest he's really thinking about, to highlight differences of approach between Britain and the European Union collectively, and European Union leading countries such as Germany. So I think that there's an element of playing to the public, of emphasizing that we're in a better situation in some way than the rest of Europe. And for my own part, I do think that Germany has been unwise to promote the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in the way that it has. So there are times when opportunism leads political leaders to say the right thing, even though they may have regrettable motives for doing so.
Okay, thank you very much for having been here with us today. I think there's many interesting points concerning the UK's relations to Russia and Ukraine in economic terms. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.